Most of the gardening advice you've heard over the last decade has cost you more money than it saved you. I've spent 30 years testing products, methods, and so-called expert tips in my own yard, and I can tell you that about half of what gets repeated on gardening channels is either outdated, oversimplified, or flat out wrong. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through the lessons that took me 3 decades to learn the hard way. We're covering soil, mulch, weeds, lawn care, tomatoes, roses, containers, landscape fabric, and a few things nobody talks about but should. Every tip here comes with a specific reason, a number, or a test result so you can stop guessing and start making decisions that pay off in your yard this season. And I've got a trick near the end for anyone whose dog keeps destroying their garden beds, so stick around for that. Let's start with the one thing that controls almost everything else in your garden: soil biology. Not soil pH, not soil amendments, not whatever bag of fertilizer the garden center put on an end cap display this week. The microbial life in your dirt determines whether your plants can absorb the nutrients already sitting there. I tested this in my own beds about 8 years ago. I had iron chlorosis on a row of gardenias, yellow leaves, textbook deficiency symptoms. I'd already added chelated iron twice with 0 improvement. The soil test came back showing adequate iron levels. The plants had plenty of iron available. They couldn't absorb it. The missing piece was microbial activity. Bacteria and fungi break down organic compounds into forms that roots can take up. Without that biological workforce, nutrients sit in the soil doing nothing, and you keep buying more supplements that also do nothing. I added quality compost and a compost tea application, and within 6 weeks those gardenias pushed out dark green growth. Same soil, same iron levels, completely different result. Think about a redwood forest for a second. Nobody fertilizes a redwood forest. Nobody sprays for aphids. Nobody amends the soil with bags from a hardware store. That ecosystem sustains itself because decades of leaf litter, fallen wood, and organic debris have built a soil teeming with beneficial bacteria, fungi, protozoa, and predatory nematodes. That's the model for your yard. You're not trying to feed your plants directly. You're trying to build the community underground that feeds them for you. And once that community is established, your maintenance drops, because healthy plants resist pests and disease on their own. I've cut my pesticide use by about 80% over the last 10 years by focusing on soil biology instead of chasing symptoms with sprays. Now here's something that connects directly to this: nematodes. Most gardeners hear that word and think of the root knot nematodes that destroy tomato roots and stunt pepper plants. But there are beneficial predatory nematodes that hunt and kill the destructive ones. The old approach was to drench the soil with chemical nematocides, which killed everything, good and bad, and left you with sterile dirt that couldn't support a weed, let alone a tomato. Predatory nematodes applied in water during early morning or late evening, once a year in early spring, give you targeted control without collateral damage. A single application of beneficial nematodes covers roughly 200 square feet per container, depending on the species and brand, and they reproduce in the soil, so you're establishing a population, not renting a temporary fix. And this brings up something I wish someone had told me 20 years ago about watering and soil biology. Most people water on autopilot. They set their timer in April and don't touch it until October. That constant shallow watering does 2 things wrong at once. It keeps the top inch of soil wet, which is where weed seeds germinate, and it trains roots to stay shallow instead of pushing deep where moisture is more stable. I switched to deeper, less frequent irrigation about 12 years ago and measured the difference. My water usage dropped by roughly 25% across the season, and the plants performed better because their roots were chasing moisture down to 8 and 10 inches instead of camping at the surface. Deep roots also access a wider range of minerals, which ties back to that whole nutrient uptake conversation we started with. If your soil biology is strong and your roots are deep, you've solved 2 problems with 1 change. Let's talk mulch, because I see the same mistake in yard after yard. People buy the cheapest bag of shredded bark they can find, spread it once, and then wonder why it's blown into the driveway 2 weeks later. Or they skip mulch entirely and spend every weekend pulling weeds. A consistent 2-inch layer of double-ground shredded cedar stays in place better than almost any other organic mulch I've tested. The fibers mat together and lock down. That matters especially if you have a landscape crew running blowers through your beds. Finer mulches and single-ground bark scatter everywhere. Cedar also breaks down slowly, so you're not replacing it every 3 months. I top mine off once a year, and that 2-inch depth suppresses about 90% of annual weed germination, because most weed seeds need light contact to sprout, and 2 inches of dense mulch blocks that signal. Here's an original test I ran that surprised me. I set up 2 identical 4x8 raised beds, same soil mix, same exposure. One got 2 inches of cedar mulch, the other got 2 inches of straw. After 12 weeks in summer, the straw bed had roughly 4 times more weed seedlings. Straw often carries its own weed seeds, and it breaks down faster, exposing bare soil sooner. Cedar cost me about 40% more per cubic yard, but saved me hours of weeding. Over a full season, the cedar bed was cheaper in total labor and materials combined. One more thing about mulch that doesn't get mentioned enough. Dyed mulches, those bright red and black options you see stacked outside every big box store, are often made from recycled wood pallets and construction debris. Some of that source material contains chromated copper arsenate, which is a wood preservative with arsenic in it. If you're mulching around vegetable beds or fruit trees, that's a real concern. I stick with natural cedar or hardwood mulch from a known source. The cost difference is maybe $5 per cubic yard, and you're not gambling on what chemicals might be leaching into the soil your food grows in. Speaking of weeds, let's handle lawns. A thick, healthy lawn is the best weed suppression you can get. Weeds colonize bare patches and thin turf. If you eliminate the bare patches, you eliminate most of the opportunity. 3 things make that happen. First, proper irrigation. Your sprinkler heads need head-to-head coverage, meaning each sprinkler throws water all the way to the next sprinkler head, not halfway. Halfway coverage creates dry rings that thin out and invite crabgrass and clover. Second, mowing height matters, but it depends entirely on your grass type. Bermuda and improved Bermuda varieties thrive with low mowing around 1 to 1.5 inches. Tall fescue and cool season grasses need to stay at 3 to 4 inches. Mow fescue too short and you stress the plant, thin the canopy, and hand the ground to weeds. Third, overseeding. I overseed once in fall and sometimes again in spring. This fills every gap before weeds find it. Between proper water coverage, correct mowing height, and regular overseeding, you're creating a turf so dense that weed seeds land on a mat of grass blades and never reach soil. Change your mowing pattern each time you cut too. Running the same line every week creates ruts and compaction strips where weeds establish first. For anyone dealing with shade under deciduous trees, here's a grass combination that works. Perennial ryegrass does well in full sun and handles winter beautifully when those trees drop their leaves and let light through. But once spring canopy fills in, ryegrass thins out fast in the shade. Creeping red fescue and chewings fescue are the most shade-tolerant lawn grasses available. I've seen them hold up under tree cover where every other grass gave up. Mix them into a Bermuda lawn and you'd be hard-pressed to spot the difference from 10 feet away. If fescue won't grow in a shaded spot, no lawn grass will, and you should consider ground cover or gravel instead of fighting a losing battle. Now, tomatoes. Blossom end rot drives gardeners crazy and leads to a lot of bad advice. You'll hear people say it's a calcium deficiency and tell you to add eggshells or gypsum. In most cases, your soil has enough calcium. The plant can't move it to the fruit fast enough during certain stress windows. I grew Whopper tomatoes last season and lost about 1/3 of the first set of fruit to blossom end rot. Same plants, same soil, same watering schedule produced the next round of fruit with 0 blossom end rot. Nothing changed in the ground. What changed was the weather. A heat spike followed by irregular watering during that first fruiting window caused the uptake problem. Once conditions stabilized, the plants handled calcium uptake fine on their own. So before you dump amendments into your tomato bed, check whether the issue is environmental stress. because 9 times out of 10, it is. Here's a related tip on tomatoes that I picked up from tracking my own harvests over 5 seasons. Consistent watering matters more than total volume. I ran 2 test rows of the same Roma variety one summer. One row got 2 inches of water per week in a single deep soak. The other got the same 2 inches split into 4 lighter sessions. The split watering row produced 15% fewer cracked fruit and had no blossom end rot at all. The single soak row had periodic dry stress between waterings that triggered calcium transport issues in the fruit. You don't need to water more. You need to water on a tighter schedule, so the plant never experiences that feast or famine cycle that triggers deficiency symptoms. Roses intimidate people for no good reason. Hybrid teas have this reputation for requiring surgical precision during pruning, and that reputation keeps a lot of gardeners from planting them at all. I attended a pruning seminar years ago where the instructor said something that stuck with me. He told the room that if you grabbed the whole bush, bunched the canes together, and cut off 2/3 of the plant, the rows would respond perfectly well. It wouldn't win a show for textbook pruning form, but it would bloom hard the following season. I've done that rough chop on my own hybrid teas when I ran out of time in January, and every single one came back strong. Don't let pruning anxiety keep you from growing roses. They're tougher than their reputation. And since we're talking about pruning fear, the same applies to most flowering shrubs. I see people refusing to cut back hydrangeas, crepe myrtles, even butterfly bushes because they're afraid of removing next year's blooms. Here's what I've learned after killing a few plants and saving a lot more. Most flowering shrubs fall into one of 2 categories. They either bloom on old wood, meaning last year's growth, or they bloom on new wood, meaning this season's fresh stems. If you know which category your plant falls into, pruning becomes a 5-minute decision, not a source of dread. Hydrangea macrophylla blooms on old wood, so you prune right after flowering. Hydrangea paniculata blooms on new wood, so you prune in late winter. I've seen people avoid pruning their paniculata for 3 years running and end up with a leggy, floppy mess producing half the flower heads it should have. A confident cut in February would have given them twice the blooms on a tighter, stronger frame. Container gardening. There's a persistent myth that you need to replace your potting soil every year. Garden centers love this idea because it sells more bags of mix. But if you maintain the biology in your containers by adding compost or a liquid microbial product once or twice a year, that soil stays productive. You might need to top it off as it settles, maybe adding an inch or 2, but wholesale replacement is unnecessary expense and labor. I have containers that haven't had a full soil change in 4 years, and they're producing better now than they did with fresh mix because the microbial community has matured. The one exception is if you had a serious disease issue in a pot. In that case, dump the soil and start clean. Otherwise, feed the biology and save your money. And while we're on containers, stop putting gravel in the bottom of your pots. I know this advice has been around forever, and it sounds logical. A drainage layer should help water move through faster, right? Wrong. When you create an interface between 2 materials with different textures, like fine potting soil sitting on top of coarse gravel, water does not flow freely from one to the other. The soil layer has to become fully saturated before any water crosses into the gravel. You're creating a perched water table right in the root zone, which is the opposite of good drainage. A pot with a drain hole and quality potting soil all the way down drains better than a pot with 3 inches of gravel taking up space at the bottom. I tested this with 2 identical pots and a moisture meter. The gravel pot retained measurably more moisture in the lower soil layer 24 hours after watering. Skip the gravel. It's doing the opposite of what you think. Landscape fabric. I have a strong opinion on this one, and I'm not going to soften it. Landscape fabric in planted beds is a bad idea that creates problems on a delay. The day you install it, sure, it works. Water and air pass through, weeds can't push up, everything looks great for a month or 2. Then mulch starts decomposing on top of it, fine soil particles settle into the weave, and that fabric starts clogging. Within a year or 2, water penetration drops significantly. I've pulled up fabric that was installed 3 years prior and found bone-dry soil underneath while the surrounding unfabbed areas were properly moist. Plant roots grow into and through the fabric, turning it into a tangled mess that's nearly impossible to remove without damaging root systems. In hardscape areas, under a gravel path or a patio base, fabric can make sense. In planted beds, avoid it completely. Mulch alone handles weed suppression without choking your plants over time. For noise reduction, most people plant one row of shrubs and call it a sound barrier. One row does almost nothing. Sound waves travel over a single height screen without much resistance. Effective noise reduction requires staggered heights. Start with a 3 to 4 foot planting closest to the area you want to protect, then a 5 to 6 foot layer behind it, then a 10 to 15 foot screen at the back. You're creating a ramp that directs sound waves upward and over your outdoor space. I measured ambient noise levels in a client's backyard before and after installing a 3-tier planting along a busy road. The reduction was roughly 6 to 8 decibels at seated height, which doesn't sound dramatic on paper, but felt like the difference between needing to raise your voice during a conversation and being able to talk normally. Design-wise, don't overthink curves. Straight lines and clean geometry work for the majority of residential properties and are far easier to maintain. Curved bed edges require constant recutting to stay crisp, and meandering paths waste usable yard space. I've designed with both. On most houses, especially anything with angular architecture, straight lines look sharper and cost less to install and maintain over the long term. Curves have their place in naturalistic or large-scale landscapes, but for a typical 6,000 to 10,000 square foot lot, clean lines win on aesthetics and practicality. Right plant, right place. Everyone has heard this phrase, and most people ignore it the moment they see a plant they like at the nursery. Shade plants in full sun will survive if you pour enough water on them, but that extra water brings extra weeds, extra fungal pressure, and extra maintenance. Every gallon of unnecessary irrigation you add creates downstream problems. I tracked water use on a bed of hostas I planted in partial sun versus a bed in full shade. The partial sun bed needed roughly 60% more water to keep the plants from scorching, and it developed powdery mildew twice that season. The shade bed had 0 disease issues. Match the plant to the exposure your yard provides and your maintenance drops along with your water bill. Here's something else worth your time if you've been gardening for a few years but can't figure out why certain plants keep failing. Get a soil test. Not the probe you stick in the ground from the hardware store, an actual lab test. Your county extension office will run one for somewhere between $15 and $30 in most states. You send in a sample and they give you back precise numbers for nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, pH, and organic matter content. I've seen gardeners spend $200 a year on amendments they didn't need because they never bothered with a $20 test. One of my neighbors was adding sulfur every spring to lower his soil pH, and his soil was already at 6.3, which is slightly acidic and perfect for most plants. He was creating a problem that didn't exist. A lab test takes the guessing out of everything and pays for itself the first season by telling you what not to buy. One more for the dog owners. If your dog tears up garden beds and tracks mud through the house, replace exposed soil around plantings with 3/4 inch rock or larger. Dogs tend to avoid digging in rock at that size. Anything smaller, like 3/8 inch pea gravel, and they'll dig through it almost as readily as dirt. I've seen this work with confirmed diggers. 3/4 inch river rock or decorative stone like rainbow rock stops the behavior without blocking water or air from reaching roots. Keep the rock layer thin, an inch or so it doesn't smother the soil underneath. You can still apply liquid soil amendments right over the rock and they'll filter through to the root zone. So here's what I want you to do this week. Pick one bed in your yard that's been underperforming. Check the soil moisture, check the mulch depth, and add compost or a microbial product if you haven't in the last 6 months. If you've never had your soil tested through a lab, order that test now, because everything else you do in your garden should be informed by those numbers. Those 2 actions, building your biology and knowing your baseline, address the root cause behind chlorosis, pest problems, poor growth, and weak plants all at once. Stop treating symptoms with products. Build the biology, know your soil, and let the system do the work.